All right. So, as many of you already know, I've been spending a fair bit of time on this channel talking a little bit about and thinking about asking the question, why do people create people? Trying to get to the bottom of that. Why? Why would you do that to yourself? No, but I recognize in myself, again, if I'm being serious, I recognize certain facets of parenthood that would be incredibly fulfilling. I don't know what it is. I've never created a person. I don't know what it is to raise a person, but I do strongly feel that there would be aspects of it that would be incredibly fulfilling. Maybe it wouldn't fill that void inside of myself entirely, but I do think that it would probably help in some ways. And then in many ways, it wouldn't. It would make things worse. It would make and yeah. There's so many ways in which I could fuck that whole situation up. But the point is asking the question: why do people do that? Why do people take it upon themselves to raise, to initially conceive, and then carry that conception to term, and then raise their children? Why do people do that? And it's a very unfortunate thing that many people don't really think about what it means to do that. I think this is quite clear. It's quite blatant that many people don't really consider what it means to create a person before they end up creating people. And it's bad. That's a bad thing. I think everybody should be able to agree. The fact that many people who create people don't really think about it, it's not good. But it's also complex. And just like there are some aspects of it that aren't as complex. But in this video, I'm going to talk about the less complex aspects of it, I guess, that I've been thinking about more so lately. I've been giving a lot of thought to and contemplation to lately. I'm just going to share some thoughts on why I feel very many people do end up creating people. And a lot of it, just in general, I think it's worth mentioning, just in general, when it comes to people, even intentionally, deliberately deciding to try for a child and deciding whether or not to do that, and in the cases where people are deciding to just take additional precaution when having sex as to avoid an accidental conception, or having to decide whether or not to get an abortion, all of these questions that people ask themselves, primarily they're going to be focused far more on how will, whichever action I end up going with, how will this action impact my own life? What will I have to endure? What will I get out of it? What sort of sacrifices will I have to make in order to ensure that my child will go on to, if I do end up having a child, to ensure that my child will have the highest of odds of going on to live a life that's worth living, that's a fulfilling existence. And insofar as people think about it at all, like future outcomes at all, it's very idealized. Typically, it's very romanticized, quite short-sighted in many cases. And it is not a coincidence either that for many dudes, for example, when it comes to the accidental conceptions and asking the question as to, well, what will I have to sacrifice if I am to knock a woman up? What sort of consequences will I have to endure as a consequence of that action? And many dudes, the answer is nothing. Zero sacrifice needs to, even just, in many cases, especially when it comes to accidentally conceived that are then carried to term, in many cases, the dude doesn't feel any obligation. There isn't any sort of sacrifice that he has to make as a consequence of that. Even in just like just little monthly payments to support their children in that way, like it's quite easy for dudes to weasel out of this. And I, in my own personal life, I know more than one that that is like this and that has done this, just thoughtlessly, carelessly, no concern for the outcomes. Like many dudes don't think about, and so far as they think about it at all, they don't care all that much about like whether or not the woman that they've knocked up will decide to keep it or not. And it primarily comes down to, well, how is it going to affect me? Because many of us are very solipsistic and selfish creatures. And the answer in many cases is, well, I don't have to do shit. So That's not good. And then, of course, in many cases, when it comes to women who are having sex with these dudes, in many, many cases, the answer to the question from their point of view, and so again, insofar as they think about future outcomes, what will I have to endure? What will I have to sacrifice? Because that's going to be the main question. It's not going to be, well, what kind of quality of life will my child have if I do end up accidentally conceiving, or if I carry that accidental conception to term? Like, what will be the outcomes insofar as what my children will have to endure? No, it's going to be far more focused on, well, what am I going to have to do? And the answer, in many cases, from their perspective, is very little, I mean, in many cases, you have lots and lots of single moms who don't have to do a goddamn thing in terms of, there are certain facets of it that are appealing to many young girls, young women, insofar as having a child, even with having a child with someone that they didn't really know all that well, who doesn't look to be on board with attempting to help them in taking care of their children, even just financially, let alone emotionally, providing emotional support and bonding with their children. They'll think about these very short-sighted areas that appeal to them, like creating a little miniature version of themselves. They'll think about that. What will that be like? To have a little plaything that came from me. It's a part of myself, and I'll be able to recognize that, and that'll be quite neat. to fucking have a little extension of myself, a little somewhat of a copy. That'll be cool. And that's insofar as people think about future outcomes, many young women, that'll be the main focus. How cool will that be to have a little version of myself? And again, very idealized also, because they won't oftentimes think about the sleepless nights and all the shit that's going to come along with that. And again, in many cases, and in many cases, they don't have to worry about financially supporting their offspring, so that this isn't a concern either. So just, I guess to put it simply, when people are having children, the main focus is going to be on how will this impact me, what will I gain from it, and what will I have to sacrifice as a consequence of the action of having a child. And in many cases, the answer is, well, they oftentimes don't feel much obligation to even attempt to make it to where their children will be more likely to live lives that they themselves would deem to be worth living. In many cases, in particular with dudes who just knock up women without a care in the world, and then the women who fuck these dudes, they don't really think about, again, insofar as what their children's qualities of life will be and what all that will consist of. Insofar as they think about future outcomes, they're more focused on, well, how cool will it be to have a little version of myself? That's a lot of it. And again, it's complicated, but a lot of it isn't that complicated, and that's large portions of, that's a hell of a lot of the motivations as to why many people conceive. In summary, they don't really think about it at all. Again, comes back down to that. In many cases, people just don't really care all that much about what sort of lives, what sort of outcomes their children will have in their lives. And it's also, of course, worth mentioning, there are tons of single moms, for example, that work their asses off to provide for their children financially and emotionally, and they take on that gigantic burden. They take it upon themselves, and they have to do that alone. And there are cases where, because this is where all the gray comes in, right? Like, it's easy, when we're young, to really steeply underestimate consequences, and like it or not, a lot of women are into this idea of finding a guy to fix. It appeals to many women if they, come across a guy and they recognize that he's a piece of shit, but they're like, well, I can fix him. And they typically don't succeed in doing that. And you have that in many, and I've met women that are like that are just, arguable that they've shot themselves in the foot a little bit, but they're doing all that they can to provide, a life that they themselves, they're trying their hardest to be great moms, and you can see that in a lot of cases. And yeah, it's very easy to fuck up severely when we're young. Same thing with dudes. Same thing with a lot of guys who just, yeah, they wanted a quick nut, and then it's like, whoops, she's now pregnant, and she wants to keep it, and it's just not up to you. It's out of your hands. And that was a predicament that I was very nearly in not that long ago. So a lot of it is just very, very steep underestimations of consequences. And, especially when we're young, we do some dumb fucking shit that we are very likely to later end up regretting. So you have it in many cases where, men will accidentally conceive or just, not giving it much thought, but then they will over time do all that they can to, again, ensure that their children will live lives that they themselves, they attempt to do as good a job as they can. They fucked up, but they're trying their hardest to do what they can going forward, and that's really, it's all we can do. But yeah, there's plenty of those on both sides of the fence with men and women who, did some dumb shit when they were young and ended up paying a great fucking price for it, but they're doing all that they possibly can to, at the very least, provide for their children emotionally, financially, in the best possible way that they can. There's lots of that. But coming back to, there is a lot, and I mean a lot of people, men and women, who just don't give a shit about the outcomes of their children's lives at all. Not only did they conceive them unintentionally, they didn't care, and they continue to do it. Many dudes, for example, just continue to shoot load after load into as many fertile holes as they can. It's like, fuck it. And then many women will fuck these dudes again. Like, they'll just keep shooting themselves in the foot. It's a kink for some people to just really sabotage their lives and destroy not only their lives, but the lives of their children in many cases. They seem to get off on it. There's lots of that as well. But yeah, I'm focusing more on, in this video, on the cases where when they're rather young, people do dumb shit. And you have plenty of people that do their best moving forward as they possibly can. And then you have people who just give virtually no fuck about the outcomes of their children's lives. And unfortunately, this is a lot of it. A lot. To where they don't even attempt. They don't even try to make the best out of their fuck-ups. They just continue to fuck up without a care in the world. And yeah, it's pretty fucked up. And let me know what you think. Let me know what your thoughts are, as always. I like the idea of having constructive discussions down there. But yeah, no, I know people that fall into both camps, where when they were young, they had children with someone that they really shouldn't have had children with, but they do all that they can. Both parties, both parents involved, do all that they can going forward to do as good of a job as they possibly can. And then you have plenty of people on both sides, men and women, who just zero fucks given about the outcomes of their children's lives. And I think that, from what I see, I think the latter is more common. That people who do initially conceive unintentionally, and then they really do oftentimes end up being the worst parents possible. Like, genuinely, there are many that fucked up, but then they do a terrific job of again doing the best they can. But there are many that just don't give a single shit, and they'll just continue to not give a single shit about their already existing children or their children that they're just continuing to bring into being. And it's quite something. It's quite something. Really is. And this is also why it's just, this topic, discussing it, is futile as shit, because you have so many people that just genuinely don't care. You have so many people that don't. It isn't even just a matter of like, oh well, hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20 after all. We all do dumb shit when we're young. No, you have many people that just continue the cycle of shit, just mindlessly, with no concern for the outcomes. I mean, seemingly the outcomes of their own lives, let alone the lives of their children. And you know, it's bad. But let me know what your thoughts are. Yeah. Please